All right, let's dive in. You know those hot spots, the ones that grab the headlines but leave you kind of scratching your head about what's really going on.
Right. Where you just get the what, but not really the why.
Exactly. So we're going deep today, really dissecting things, and we've got some awesome sources to guide us.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Me too. So let's start with, well, the Middle East always seems to be,
A good place to start.
well, yeah, always a lot happening. But specifically Gaza this time. Over 100 rockets fired into Israel. A ceasefire that's, well, let's just say it's shaky at best. And then you throw former President Trump into the mix, it feels like a powder keg ready to explode.
It definitely has that sense of urgency, doesn't it? And it's important to remember this isn't just some random flare-up. This is directly, threatening that 2022 ceasefire.
All right, the one brokered by Egypt.
Right. And it was always, I think, considered a bit fragile, But this is really putting it to the test.
And speaking of testing the waters, one of the sources mentioned former President Trump, specifically his criticism of the ceasefire. How does that play into all of this?
Well, it throws a whole other wrench into the works.
Yeah.
It really does. Because, you think about it, he's essentially, by saying it needs to be reevaluated, emboldening those hardliners on both sides.
You mean both within Hamas?
Hamas, yeah,
Yeah.
and in Israel.
Hmm.
Those who don't want to give an inch. Exactly. Those who just say, no negotiations. It's almost like it disrupts that whole delicate balance of diplomacy.
Yeah, throws it off completely.
Uh-huh.
So where does the UN fit into all of this? They seem to be cautiously optimistic, but also, acknowledging the huge challenges ahead.
They are really urging immediate action to try to save what's left of the truce.
Yeah.
But honestly, it feels like an uphill battle. Some analysts are even saying they don't see stability lasting past like early March. Yeah, citing all sorts of, political divides within both societies, Palestinian and Israeli. And of course, there's the constant security concerns. Both sides are saying they want to de-escalate, but their actions,
Don't exactly match up.
they really don't. It's almost a game of chicken at this point. Very dangerous.
So Gaza it really is on the verge, isn't it?
Seems like it.
What are the implications, for the whole region if things really boil over?
Well, it's interesting because what happens in Gaza doesn't stay in Gaza, right?
Mhm.
It kind of puts that whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict under a microscope.
Yeah.
You see how deep the historical tensions run, how incredibly difficult it is to find a lasting solution.
Yeah.
And then when you bring in, like the UN, figures like former President Trump, you realize that's not just a local conflict.
Right. It has global ripples.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of things heating up, let's shift gears a bit and look at Europe, specifically Ukraine. There are some worrying reports about a Russian offensive near Bakhmut. And it sounds like Ukraine is really struggling to hold the line.
Well, the real anxiety about Bakhmut is all about its location, its strategic importance.
Huh.
If Russia manages to capture it, and this is in eastern Ukraine, it would give them a real leg up.
Yeah.
A big military advantage. Could even swing the momentum of the war in their favor.
One of our sources said Ukraine needs a staggering number of new troops.
Yeah, it's something like,
150,000.
is that even remotely possible?
150,000, yeah. To be honest, it's a huge ask. To put it in perspective, that's more than the entire active duty military of a lot of European countries.
Wow.
It just shows how much pressure Ukraine is under, how badly they need that continued international support.
And what does that support actually look like on the ground?
Well, it's a mix of everything, really.
Uh-huh.
Military aid, intelligence sharing, financial assistance, you name it.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about sophisticated air defense systems from the U.S., real-time satellite imagery, signals intelligence, even human intelligence coming from within Russia and Belarus. That's incredible.
It's vital, absolutely vital for Ukraine to have that constant flow of information and resources, especially when they're up against a much larger and more heavily equipped force.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, Russia does take Bakhmut. What happens then? Is that a turning point in the war?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Mhm.
Nobody really knows for sure.
Right.
Some analysts think, yeah, it could be a real blow to Ukraine, psychologically,
Uh-huh.
and that it might lead to, kind of a domino effect
Right.
with them losing more and more territory.
Oh.
But then there are others who say, look, Ukraine's been putting up such a fierce resistance.
Right.
And with all that Western support coming in, it could turn into they call it a Pyrrhic victory for Russia.
Right, yeah.
Meaning, yeah, they might win, but at such a high cost, so many casualties, resources depleted.
They've essentially lost.
Exactly. It's a gamble, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
So from a potential flashpoint in Ukraine, we're now heading to, well, a high-stakes meeting in Jordan. It's being billed as something that could really reshape the Middle East.
It has that potential, doesn't it?
It does. And guess who's involved?
Let me guess. Former President Trump.
Bingo!
Figures. He always seems to be at the center of things.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he? So tell me, why is this meeting in Jordan so important?
Well, Jordan's a key ally of the U.S.,
Right.
and they're facing a really, really tough decision. Whether to accept Palestinian prisoners who are currently held in Gaza. And this is, it's a decision with huge, huge implications for stability in the region.
So break it down for me. What are the potential consequences here?
Okay, so on the one hand, if Jordan takes in the prisoners, it could really damage their relationship with Israel.
And that's a close ally, right?
Very close, and crucial for regional security.
Okay.
But then you have to remember, Israel sees these prisoners as, well, security threats.
Right. They were convicted of crimes against Israel.
Exactly.
So releasing them
Would be seen as a concession to terrorism. Potentially, yeah, damaging that already fragile peace.
Okay, so not good. But what if they reject the request?
Well, then you risk alienating the Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza. And that could easily lead to more extremism, more instability, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, too.
Right. The opposite of what they're aiming for.
Exactly. And it could reignite the violence, make a peaceful resolution even harder to reach.
So Jordan's really between a rock and a hard place.
They really are. It's a lose-lose situation almost.
What factors do you think they'll be considering as they make this decision?
Oh, a whole bunch. Obviously, their relationship with Israel, but also the risk of unrest within Jordan itself.
Right, their own internal stability.
Exactly. And then you have the pressure from the international community, especially the U.S., and of course, with former President Trump involved, who knows what wild card he might throw into the mix.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how all of these events we've talked about today, the situation in Gaza, the battle for Bakhmut, this meeting in Jordan, they're all interconnected in some way.
It really is.
It really highlights how interconnected our world is. What happens in one place can have these ripple effects that reach across the globe.
Absolutely. They're all pieces of the same puzzle, even if they seem unrelated at first glance.
That's why we do these deep dives, right?
You
To
will.
connect those dots, to see the bigger picture.
To try to make sense of it all.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like every move has the potential to, set off a chain reaction, sometimes with consequences you don't even see coming.
Right, like a game of global chess or something.
Exactly. And speaking of unpredictable moves, we have to talk about, well, former President Trump. I mean, he's a factor in all three of these situations, and he just adds another layer of, well, uncertainty.
Yeah, he's definitely a wild card, isn't he? And his presence, especially in the Middle East, it seems to, it injects a certain volatility, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. You see it playing out in Gaza. With his criticism of the ceasefire, he's emboldened both Hamas and, well, those in Israel who aren't exactly fans of any kind of negotiated peace.
Right.
His words carry a lot of weight, even now. And it's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
So what about his role in the Jordan meeting? He's acting as a mediator, right? What do you make of that?
It's interesting, right? He's back on the world stage, and, well, everyone's watching to see what he'll do. I mean, his approach to foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, it's always been, shall we say, unconventional.
You put it mildly.
Yeah. He relies a lot on personal relationships,
Yeah.
deal-making. Not so much on the traditional diplomatic channels.
So will it work this time?
Who knows? It's really anyone's guess at this point.
Okay, so let's dig into this Jordan meeting a bit more. What are the core issues at play here?
It all comes down to the Palestinian prisoners in Gaza. Jordan has to decide whether to accept them. And, well, as we discussed, it's a decision loaded with potential problems.
Right, you said it could really strain things between Jordan and Israel. Why is that?
Well, from Israel's perspective, these prisoners are dangerous. Legitimate security threats. I mean, they were convicted of serious crimes against Israel, and releasing them, for a lot of Israelis, it would be like, giving in to terrorism.
Rewarding violence.
Exactly. And it could really undermine the peace between Jordan and Israel.
And that piece is crucial, right?
Absolutely, for the whole region.
So what if Jordan says no? What are the risks there?
Rejection could be seen as a betrayal, especially by the Palestinians in Gaza.
Right.
And it could easily lead to more anti-Jordanian sentiment, which could fuel extremism and instability.
Not just in Gaza, but...
The West Bank, too, yeah. And the last thing anyone needs is more violence, but unfortunately, that's a very real possibility if Jordan rejects the request.
So they're in a tough spot no matter what they do.
They really are. It's a delicate balancing act.
So what factors do you think will be most important as they try to make this decision? Well, they have to think about their relationship with Israel, of course, but also what could happen within Jordan itself? Unrest, protests, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then there's the pressure from the international community, especially the U.S.
Right. And with former President Trump in the mix.
Exactly. It's really a complex situation.
It's amazing, isn't it, how it's all connected? I mean, what happens in Gaza could influence Jordan's decision, and then the outcome of that meeting could affect the whole region.
It's a domino effect, really.
Exactly. These events aren't isolated, are they?
Not at all. They're all part of this, this global ecosystem. What happens in one place can trigger reactions somewhere else entirely. It's a reminder that we have to think globally, look at the big picture. Because what seems like an isolated event
Can have these huge consequences.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go back to Ukraine for a moment. We talked about Bakhmut and why it's so important, but what else is shaping this conflict, do you think? Well, one really important factor is the debate within the international community about how much and what kind of support Ukraine should get.
Right. Some countries are hesitant to give them too much, especially the more advanced weaponry.
Exactly. They're worried about escalating the conflict,
Yeah.
provoking Russia. They think giving Ukraine certain weapons could be seen as a threat.
But others say Ukraine needs those weapons to defend itself.
Right. They argue that without enough help, especially those more sophisticated systems, Ukraine can't possibly push back against Russia.
And they'll lose.
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
Yeah.
Trying to help Ukraine defend itself without, accidentally starting a bigger war.
And the stakes are high?
Incredibly high. The decisions being made right now
Will have a huge impact.
for years to come, yeah.
And let's not forget about the economic impact of all of this.
Oh, right.
We're already seeing higher energy prices, disruptions to global supply chains.
Yeah, it's already being felt everywhere.
And it's probably going to get worse,
Yeah.
right? The longer this goes on.
Absolutely. The economic fallout from this war is, well, it's already a problem. And it just adds to the pressure, for governments to find a way to stop the fighting.
But as we've discussed, there are no easy answers.
No, not at all. It's a very complex situation, very dangerous, with no clear path to peace.
It all sounds so, bleak.
Yeah.
Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution, to any of these conflicts? Or are we just heading for more violence and instability?
That's the question everyone's asking, isn't it?
Yeah.
The path to peace is never easy, especially with conflicts like these. They're so deep-rooted, so complex.
Right.
But history shows us that diplomacy, dialogue, they can work, even in the darkest of times. It takes a willingness to compromise, though, to try to see the other side's point of view, to work together towards a common goal.
But that's not easy.
No, it's not. It's a difficult process, often frustrating.
But it's the only way.
It really is. The only way to break the cycle of violence.
That's a good point. It's a message of hope, something we need to hold on to even when things look really bad. We can't give up.
Right. We have to keep looking for solutions, keep pushing for dialogue, for understanding, keep believing that peace is possible, even if it seems impossible right now.
I agree. So are there specific things that could be done to, let's say, de-escalate things in Gaza to try to prevent a full-blown war?
Well, one important step would be for everyone involved to, really commit to that 2022 ceasefire.
Yeah.
That means no more rockets from Gaza into Israel, lifting the blockade to ease the humanitarian crisis. Yeah. And a real effort to address the underlying issues that are fueling the conflict.
It sounds like a tall order.
It is. It requires political will, a commitment to dialogue, and those things are, they're in short supply right now.
And what about Ukraine? What could lead to a negotiated settlement there?
The key is finding a way to address Russia's security concerns without, sacrificing Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Right, so they can still be independent and in control of their own territory.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance, and it's going to require some really creative diplomacy, flexibility from everyone involved, and a willingness to compromise, even when it's hard.
It sounds almost impossible.
It's a huge challenge, but it's the only way to achieve a lasting peace.
And then there's Jordan. Their decision could affect the whole Middle East, right?
Absolutely. It could either help stabilize things, maybe even open the door for more dialogue, or it could make things even worse, make peace even harder to achieve.
So much is riding on their decision.
The whole world is watching.
It's incredible, isn't it, how complex these situations are. Each one has its own challenges, its own potential consequences. But you're right, we can't lose hope.
Definitely not. We have to keep pushing for dialogue, for understanding, for peaceful solutions.
Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about former President Trump and his involvement in all of
All
this.
right.
You said it adds unpredictability. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, his approach to foreign policy has always been a bit different, hasn't it? He often puts personal relationships first, you know, and what he sees is good deals.
More than the usual diplomatic protocols.
Exactly. And sometimes that can be an advantage
Yeah.
because he's shown he's willing to, talk directly to adversaries, to break with tradition.
Yet there's a downside too, right?
Yeah, because his unpredictability, his tendency to just act on impulse, it can create a lot of uncertainty, a lack of trust. Other world leaders, they don't always know what to expect from him or if they can even take him at his word.
So it makes it harder to negotiate.
It can, because they're never quite sure what his real intentions are.
So in the Jordan meeting, for example, he could help things along, or he could be a huge roadblock.
Exactly. He's like a wild card in an already complicated situation. You just can't predict what he'll do. He adds this whole other layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
It's like watching a high-stakes poker game with the fate of nations at stake.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to analyze. All these moving parts, so many unknowns, and the stakes are so high. It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing.
And that's what makes these deep dives so important.
Absolutely.
We can really take the time to, unpack these issues, understand the details, the connections, and really grapple with the complexity.
Yeah, it's about going beyond the headline.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around, trying to make sense of it all these events and what they might mean for the future.
It is. But that's geopolitics in a nutshell, right? It's realizing that our world, it's this intricate system, and what happens in one place, it can really set off chain reactions that, well, that can be felt across continents.
So as we wrap things up, what are the key takeaways? What do you hope people listening will remember from our deep dive today?
Well, first and foremost, I really hope they come away with an understanding of just how complicated these situations are. There are no, easy answers, no clear-cut solutions.
Yeah, all black and white.
Right. Every decision, every action, it has potential risks and rewards, intended and unintended consequences.
It's about seeing the nuance, the different perspectives, and not, oversimplifying things.
Exactly. And secondly, I hope they realized just how interconnected global events really are. What happens in Gaza, it can affect Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine, it can affect Jordan, and so on.
Right, it's like a domino effect.
Yeah, we're all part of this globalized world, and events in one region, they can have ripple effects that touch everyone, everywhere. We can't afford to ignore what's happening outside our own little bubbles.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, understanding those connections, and recognizing that we're all in this together.
Absolutely. And finally, I hope this deep dive encourages people to stay informed, to keep learning and engaging with these global issues.
Right, because the more we
The
understand.
better equipped we'll be to navigate them, to make informed decisions, and to push for solutions that actually promote peace and stability.
That's such an important point. It's not about being overwhelmed by how complicated things are, but about feeling empowered to engage with that complexity, to become more informed and, active citizens of the world.
Exactly.
So before we go, I have to ask, is there one question, one thought that you would like to leave our listeners with today? Something to ponder, to maybe spark some further exploration, some reflection?
Okay, so here's something to consider. We talked a lot about the potential outcomes of the meeting in Jordan, but what about those unintended consequences? How might Jordan's decision, regardless of what they decide, how might it impact other countries in the region? Could it embolden Iran? Could it destabilize Lebanon? Or could it, maybe, against all odds, create an opportunity for progress?
Wow, those are some really thought-provoking questions.
A lot to think about.
It is, and that's what makes this all so fascinating, right? There's always more to uncover, more layers to peel back.
Exactly. It's about staying curious, staying engaged, and never losing sight of the big picture. And of course, always holding on to that hope that we can, together, build a more peaceful and just world.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into some of the world's most pressing issues. Keep exploring, stay curious, and never stop questioning.